Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're sitting down with a repeat guest and friend of the show, the one and the only John Philip Newell, who has written a brand new book called The Great Search, Turning to Earth and Soul in the Quest for Healing and Home. And so JP, welcome back to the podcast. It's always great to have time with you.
Thank you, Glenn. Very good to be with you again.
Thank you. So last time you were here, we talked about your book, Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul, which has quickly become one of my favorite books. And this book, your new book, to me, as I was reading it, it feels kind of like almost like an extension of that book in a lot of ways. And so I thought maybe to kind of kick off our conversation, could you talk to us a little bit about where this particular book picks up in relation to the last one? And then maybe like the big ideas, like maybe compare and contrast, like how is this book different from that book? And then we'll jump in and see where the good spirit leads us.
Yeah, great. Well, for those with eyes to see, there is a deep continuity between Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul, and this new book, The Great Search. I suppose one of the primary differences or distinctnesses of this new book is that whereas in the last book I was drawing from great prophetic teachers in the Celtic Christian world, in this one I'm drawing from great prophetic teachers, writers from a wide variety of religious traditions and spiritual backgrounds in different parts of the world. And I think, I suppose the main emphasis in Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul, as the title suggests, is that I was speaking of the essential sacredness of Earth and every life form, and the sacredness of the heart of every human being, and looking at the big implications to, well, if we say Earth and every life form is sacred, if we say every human being is essentially sacred, then it really radically challenges how we see one another, how we think about one another, how we interrelate. So I take those two themes, as the subtitle of the new book indicates, turning to earth and soul in the quest for healing and home. And I look at many of the parallels between these great teachers. Here they are from vastly different religious traditions and spiritual backgrounds, but they too are pointing to earth as our place of deep healing and our place of a sort of essential home spiritually as well as physically. So that's the sort of commonality, or that's the thread that connects the two books, and those relate, of course, to what I'm very passionate about in my life, in terms of how I want to live, in terms of the teachings I offer and what I write, pointing to sacredness of earth and sacredness of the human soul. I believe that if we don't return to an awareness of the divine at the heart of one another and all things, then I don't see a way forward. And we're living in a very urgent time, and realizing that we do desperately need to change if there is to be a future for humanity as we've known it. I think the bigger context of the new book is also related to this being a time of religious exile for so many of our brothers and sisters. Hundreds of thousands, and I would say millions of our brothers and sisters who began life within the four walls of our religious tradition of Christianity are no longer there. And we need to ask, well, why not? And what are those many people who are living in a type of exile from their religious inheritance? What are they yearning for? So the 9 chapters of this book are focused on what I believe the essential yearnings of this moment in time are. And at the very beginning of the book, in the introduction, I quote from the young Jewish woman philosopher Simone Weil, who escaped Paris just hours before the Nazi invasion of her homeland, and then tragically died before the end of the war. But Simone uses a phrase that has meant a lot to me personally, and also in relation to my writing and teaching. She speaks of the efficacy of desire, the efficacy of desire. And by that, I think she's meaning that to get in touch with the deepest yearnings of our being, the yearnings that come up from the of Godness at the heart of our being, getting in touch with those yearnings is efficacious. That is, it helps bring about, it helps realize, it helps embody what it is that the heart is deeply longing for.
Mm.
So that's what sort of guides the main themes. And then in each chapter, I take a great prophetic figure of the past and allow him or her to address these yearnings that I think are stirring in the human soul at this
Mm.
moment in time.
Mm. Yeah, both of these books read almost like it's like a introduction to JP's friends. Your friends throughout history and people who you just who have influenced you in some way in their writing or whatever the case may be, and then introducing them to us. And like I said before we hit record, which I think is important for our listeners to hear, is that like although a lot of these ideas felt very new to me, there's also something deep within where I'm like, oh, of course. Like I know that. Like wait, why haven't I thought of that before? Like it's almost like these ideas are very much wired into who I am, but over the course of my life, engaging in the world that we live in the great dichotomies that are all around us, and all the political spectrum and the religious spectrum, especially like within Christianity with fundamentalism, all these different things. Like these things that we know innately deep down inside, they become lost in the mess of everything. And I feel like this book and your other book as well is kind of calling us back home to what we've always known.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point, Glenn. I think that um, in so much of our Western Christian tradition, that has been very grounded in the doctrine of original sin, really from the fourth century onwards, when Christianity got into bed with empire, and creedal statements were formulated in the fourth century. And we need to ask lots of questions about what was happening in the fourth century
Mm.
when our religion became religion of empire and was often teaching what was convenient to empire. Um, but I think one of the features of so much of our Western religious thought is that truth has almost been seen as dispensed
Mm.
from above, from a hierarchy of authority or teaching. Whereas certainly what we come across in the Celtic world, and I believe also in these 9 teachers that I access, is the belief that what is deepest in us is of God. And therefore, when we set about to try to articulate wisdom, when we try to give expression to it, I believe that what we're doing is offering words, offering teaching to awaken a deep knowing that is already in us.
Mhm.
Even if we may never have been told these truths, I believe that when we awaken to them, we realize, this is a wisdom deep in the human soul.
Mhm.
This is not just a truth that is dispensed from above or from afar.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that you described these figures as my friends. I mean, they are they're certainly friends of my soul, and I feel I've got to know them well. And one of the blessings attached to this form of writing is that over the period of preparing a book and reflecting, I'm in fact being deeply fed by by some of the greatest spiritual thinkers humanity has known.
Mm.
And if I'm going to be fed by them, then there's greater hope that what I write is going to be a blessing for others and is going to nurture others. Um, I I remember a number of years ago during one of our Iona pilgrimage weeks, at the end of our week together on Iona, yeah, usually about 50 of us gathering from different parts of the world. And I often ask the participants to speak one word that gives expression to what their gratitude is for the week, or
Mm.
a word that expresses what has been very important to them. And there was a Buddhist gentleman as one of the pilgrims. He was there with his wife, who was Christian. And when we got to him, the word that he used, very interestingly, was transmission. And this is an important word to our Buddhist brothers and sisters, because they see that the role of a teacher is not to set himself up or herself up as an original fount of wisdom, but is rather to transmit wisdom from those who have gone before us, to distill their wisdom and to speak it in new ways for today.
Mm.
Uh, and when I heard that word transmission, I thought, I mean, that's exactly what I love to do. That's exactly what I believe in. And him saying that has helped me be more conscious that is my style of teaching,
Mm.
to distill wisdom, to try to transmit it, to speak it in new ways for today, but to realize that it is, as the great Jewish teachers often use the phrase, new ancient wisdom, new ancient words, speaking them in new ways, but realizing that these are um, deep wisdoms within the human soul made of
Yeah.
God.
Yeah. That's so good. Could you articulate for us, just I think would be helpful for our listeners, the subtitle, turning to earth and soul. If we're turning to earth and soul, what would you say that we're turning away from? Like we talked a little bit about, you mentioned about, our westernized Christianity, especially in the hierarchy and, the information, the doctrines coming from above and all these different things. But if you had to like articulate maybe just in a minute or so of what we're turning from to what we're turning to, what would that look like?
Yeah, great question. Uh, uh, Thomas Berry is the prophet in chapter 1 that I draw from heavily. He was a theologian, Christian theologian, but he preferred to call himself a geologian. Such was his emphasis on the sacredness of earth. Um, but Thomas Berry reminds us and really invites us to realize that we are earthlings, we are of earth. So I think in terms of turning to earth, I think it's turning away from having forgotten, in a sense, that we are of earth.
Mhm.
Uh, in so much of our culture and religion and education in the Western world, there's been this sense of almost the separation of humanity and earth, forgetting that we have come from the ocean and from the soil and the fecundity of earth, that this is our spiritual home as well as our physical home. So I think turning away from a forgetting, a deep forgetting that we are of earth, um, and that what we do to earth is what we do to ourselves. So I think that's one of the features of what we're turning away from a forgetting,
Mm.
uh, and a sort of anthropocentric perspective, rather than an earth-related perspective.
Mm.
And I mean, the great thing at this moment in time is it's an amazing time to be alive. It's a deeply challenging moment, of course, to be alive. But the exciting feature of this moment in time is that nearly every great discipline of thought and study is realizing that we need to focus on Earth in a type of foundational way, and to see humanity in terms of Earth rather than seeing humanity in some sort of isolation or separation from Earth.
Mm.
And then the turning to soul, um, I think one of the big distinctions here is that we need to turn away from ego and return to our true essence, which is soul. And I'm not just speaking about us individually. I'm certainly doing that, but I'm also speaking of us collectively and thinking of the enormous ego of our nations, for instance, or the enormous
Our
ego.
nation has an enormous ego.
Yeah, yeah, thinking the world needs to serve our well-being
Yeah.
and being willing to dominate and exploit other nations for the sake of our well-being, thinking that we could be well at the expense of other nations. But also the enormous ego of our species,
Mhm.
uh, forgetting that we will not be well if Earth's other life forms are not allowed to be well and to flourish. So I think is moving from ego to soul. And this is not to put down the ego, because the ego is this amazing faculty of consciousness and willpower that we've been given. And to that extent, we need a strong ego. But the distinction I want to make and that I feel very passionately about is that our ego is given not to be the center, but to serve the center. That is the center of the divine at the heart of every life form and every human being. And so we need a robust ego, a strong sense of self in order to do the work. But it's so important that whether it's in interpersonal relationship or whether it's in sort of international and interspecies and interreligious network, it's very important that our ego, whether that is individual, national, cultural, religious, that we bring our ego to serve the life of the divine at the heart of all things.
I was thinking about what you're saying before about having forgotten that we are of the earth. And this came up a few nights ago. I was laying in bed with our daughter. She's 7. I was telling her she likes to hear like a Bible story before bed. And she likes me to just tell the story, not read anything. And so typically I stick with the New Testament because they feel like they're safer stories to kind of explain. But she's like, I want to hear a story I haven't heard before. And so I said, all right. I said, well, I tell her the story of creation. So I told her the story of Adam and Eve. And I
Mm.
told her about how, God created Adam, from the dust of the ground. And she made this like weird face at me. And I said, and then, eventually there came woman and God took one of Adam's ribs. And she's like, ew, that's disgusting. So he just took one of Adam's ribs and it made it, that's so gross. Did that really happen? And she said, it must have happened that way because it's in the Bible, right? And I said, well, now I'm thinking back to when I was her age and, going into even middle school, high school, that story in a lot of times was like more of like a scientific thing where it was, well, this is exactly how it happened. Adam and Eve were the first people. This is exactly how God created them. And so now that I'm in this place of having, I think, evolved past that type of thought and doing my own deconstruction, rethinking of things, I said, well, so what if that story was being told to tell a much deeper truth? And she goes, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, if God, imagine going outside and taking your hands and scraping together all of this dirt and making something out of it. I said, whatever you make out of that dirt, it still has its connection to the earth, right? Because you made it to the dirt and made it from the dirt. I said, what if the point of the story is that, God created Adam out of the dirt to remind us of how connected that we are to the earth and how our actions, the things that we do, impact the earth that we live on, impact the other animals around us, on the earth. And I said, what if God taking the rib out of Adam to make a woman shows how connected we all are together? And I said, as you grow up, you're gonna, there's a lot of people who argue about what are the roles of men and what are the roles of women and what are men supposed to do, women supposed to do. I said, what if all of that is just a distraction from the bigger point that we're all connected together. And it was like I could see this light bulb go on in her head, that it was like, oh, so like this story didn't exactly happen that way, but is reminding us of something much deeper. And so that led to some other conversations that we're able to have. But it just reminded me that, I think, like you said, we've forgotten that we are part of the earth. I think a lot of these great religious traditions you bring up in the book can remind us of something that we know deep down is true. But again, like we said earlier, we've forgotten.
Yeah. Well, these are important and very beautiful moments with your daughter. That's
Yeah.
lovely to hear that. I think the child is much more sort of immediately receptive to the mythical.
Hmm.
I mean, they may not draw a distinction between um, myth and historic fact, but I think the way they sort of naturally um, can adapt to seeing the mythical within a story and allow story to give some expression to how we are in the universe. I
Yeah.
think it's great that you're doing that.
Thank you. Can we talk about I think chapter 3 is Martin Buber. Is that how I say the name?
Uber, yeah.
Buber, yes. So he was a Jewish teacher, and this particular chapter had a very big impact on me just because, given, again, my fundamentalist evangelical background, original sin was heavily emphasized in pretty much every aspect of my theology. But Martin, emphasizes this idea of original purity. And so most of our listeners are probably a lot of our listeners came from the same kind of world that I did. But again, just the emphasis that I'm born a sinner, God is mad at my sin, and so therefore God is mad at me. So like right from the get-go, I'm already in trouble, and babies crying in church, we were told is a sign of their sinful nature. And so I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit more about this idea of original purity, but I think most importantly, like the implications that that can have on us, like especially on children, because I think like as a child myself, it was constantly emphasized, you're born a sinner, born a sinner, born a sinner, born a sinner. And I have to imagine that it has some kind of impact on our identity as we grow. But that versus what are the implications of telling a child that they're born pure, they're born good, they're born, they're on God's good side, so to speak. They've never been on God's bad side. Like what are the implications of that versus the implications of the other?
Mm. Yeah, I believe uh, this has enormous implications
Mhm.
for how we see one another and also how we see our deepest energies. Um, so one of the prayers that Martin Buber speaks of as a prayer that many faithful Jewish men and women say every day upon waking, a type of morning prayer, is they say that the soul you have given me, O God, is pure.
Mhm.
And that's not to pretend that there's not a lot of confusion in us, that there are shadows within us, that we're out of touch often with those sort of pure depths of the divine within. But it's to say that that is what our essence is, and that is what we're being called to come back into relationship with. So the way of redemption, the way of coming into true salvation or wholeness of being, is not about becoming something other than ourselves.
Mhm.
It's about becoming truly ourselves. It's not about um, uh, us becoming somehow other than natural or more than natural. It's about becoming truly natural. And the the genius of Martin Buber expresses itself in his most seminal work, which he called I and Thou. And he so simply but profoundly um, invites us to remember that deep within us all is what he calls the eternal thou. So in terms of how I'm looking at you right now, how I'm listening to you, how I'm engaging with you, how I'm being invited to speak and think um, uh, words and thoughts that will bless you, that will bring out your essence, rather than in any sense expecting you to become like me or to conform to something else. So the eternal thou is to be looked for in the light within everyone's
Mm.
eyes. And it is to know also that deep within us, and trusting the deepest yearnings of our being, deep within us is the divine presence. And so he sees the restoration. I mean, he calls redemption the restoration of betweenness.
Mm.
And that's my true essence coming back into relationship with your true essence. It's allowing my true essence to come into a true relationship with the essence of every life form and of Earth. So it really very radically changes how we how we see one another, how we see ourselves, and how we imagine and envisage and faithfully give ourselves to the restoration of true relationship with one another and all life forms.
Mm. And that would change. I mean, I think that changes the game of salvation too, right? Because I mean, salvation for me and growing up was, you were born bad and God is angry at it, at your sin. And so somebody had to take your punishment, which was Jesus. And you
Mhm.
believe that, and now you're on God's good side again, and you get to go to heaven when you die. It's a very simplistic explanation, but that was basically the story that I took away from. But if we're removing original sin from the picture, and we're putting this original purity there, then original sin can't be the centerpiece of salvation anymore. So what would you say, like if you had to describe to somebody like what is the gospel message of Jesus the Christ? Like what was the point of the death? What was the point of the resurrection? Like how would you explain that to somebody given these terms of what we're speaking about now?
Well, I think one of Jesus's favorite mantras, and I think it's a mantra that we need to recover. Um, uh, and the mantra is that we need to be born again. And I mean, this phrase has been hijacked by um, the fundamentalist end of the Christian spectrum, and it's been used to give the impression that we need to become something other than ourselves, that we need to turn away from our essence and become something more than or other than the purely natural. Um, and let's be clear: Jesus was a rabbi. He was born a Jew, he lived a Jew, and he died a faithful Jew. And so the starting point of his teaching was not the fourth century Christian doctrine of original sin. So, by being born again, I think he's speaking of what is deepest in us, what our true essence is, coming forth again in radically new ways. And um, this is true, I think, of what he's calling us into. It's also true of the whole theme of resurrection. That it's about what is it's about the rebirth or coming again of our true essence. And I believe that his teachings are all about accessing that image of the divine that is deep within us. I mean, these are the first words spoken about humanity in Scripture, that we're made in the image and likeness of God.
Hmm.
And everything else that is said about us in Scripture needs, I believe, to be said in light of this foundational truth. And one of the prophetic figures that I draw from in the book is Julian of Norwich, 14th century mystic. and um, and I think that Julian of Norwich puts it so radically and so simply also when she says we're not just made by God, we are made of God.
Mm.
Um, and that's one of the reasons why she so loves to refer to God as mother as well as father, because she sees us as coming from the womb of the divine or out of the very essence of the divine. So to say that we're made of God, as someone like Julian says, is to say that the wisdom of the divine is deep within us, um, deeper than any ignorance of what we have done or become, and
Mm.
it's waiting to come forth again. It's waiting to be born anew in us. To say that we're made of God is to say that the creativity of the divine is deep within us, deeper than any barrenness in our lives, deeper than any apparent dead ending in our world. This capacity within us that is pure gift of God, this capacity to create what has never been before.
Mm.
And and to say that we're made of God is to say that the love longings of the divine for true relationship, for true reverence between us, is waiting to come forth, is waiting to be born again. Um, so I see I see that as the real heart of Jesus's teaching. So let's make sure that we reclaim this phrase, and
Yeah,
let's not let it be used only by one end of our religious spectrum,
that's right.
which means something very different.
Yeah. Well, again, I mean, talking about my daughter, having a child has forced me to really think about what I what I believe and how to explain different things because I want to make sure I can explain things to her in a way that makes sense. And so she's asked me like, what is this that with Jesus and his death and why did he die and all these different things. And the way I've tried to explain it to her is for me now, I see Jesus as God's reminder almost, or as God's mirror. I said, like, I think God created everybody, to be just like God. Whether you think about kindness and loving and care and peace, all these different things. But as we said earlier, living in this world, sometimes we forget, how we're supposed to live. And so Jesus is God's reminder, like, this here is who you are, and this here is how you are supposed to live. And when we wake up and we remember that and we repent, so to speak, and we turn back to the person that we've always been and we're created to be, we become that disciple. And I said there's a lot of people, back when Jesus was around, they didn't really like Jesus very much. Maybe they didn't want to wake up. They didn't want to remember. I said, so they got angry at him and they said, we got to get rid of this reminder. And so they put him on the cross. And I said, he died. I said, but just before he died, the last thing he said were the very words, I think, of God of I love you and I forgive you. And I said there was so much power in that. The story says that Jesus actually came back to life. And I said I think the emphasis there is that there's great power in love and there's great power in peace. There's great power in forgiveness. And so to your point, I've come to this place now where I see the Jesus story is so vastly different than what I was raised with, but I feel like it is so much more meaningful because I've always thought to myself, like, Jesus dying on the cross to save us from his angry dad, so to speak. Like, it seems like this story is so much more grand than that. Like, there's got to be something more to it than just that. And so I
Yeah,
feel like this that you just talked about, this is that. This is it's so much greater.
yeah. And I mean, what you're describing is very close to what we hear at different points historically in the Celtic Christian world. And it is said in the Celtic lineage of wisdom, it is said that we have forgotten who we are. We live in a state of soul forgetfulness. And Jesus is described as our memory, um, that we've forgotten who we are, and Jesus comes as our memory to waken us up, to reawaken us
Yeah.
to not only our essence, but the essence of one another and of all things made of God.
Yep. Yeah, your last book obviously had some impact on my thinking. So thank you. Do you have time for one more question?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Of these nine people that you introduced us to, I'm curious, and this might be an unfair question because I know they've all had an impact on you. But as you were maybe going through and kind of rereading their stories, rereading the things that they taught and they stood for in their lives, is there any particular individual with any particular teaching that has really had a big impact on JP Newell and your life and your journey and just the way that you carry yourself in the world, your teachings, things like that?
Mm, my goodness, you've left the most challenging question to the very end. So, but I think first of all, I would say I love them all,
Hmm.
and I've been deeply blessed by all of them, and that is why I've tried to distill their wisdom for now and for today. Um, I think the fact that I placed Thomas Berry first in chapter one is maybe a bit of an indicator that I think his vision um, is so vast in terms of uh, understanding the universe as essentially spiritual as well as physical from the very beginning. I think, in a sense, his breadth of vision and also his he's a prophetic figure in the sense that he does these two things that I think the prophet always does, and he denounces what is false. So part of what he's doing is to denounce the abuse of earth, denounce the lack of relationship with earth. But the prophet always does much more than denounce. The prophet also announces a vision and announces hope for the way forward. So his teachings uh, do this sort of twofold function of denouncing and announcing, or another way of putting it, as I try to do in the conclusion of the book. Um, the prophet is saying no to certain things, and at a deeper level, the prophet is saying yes always to our true essence and the sacredness that is within us. So, if I had to choose only one of these, and thank God I don't have to, but I think it would be Thomas Berry. I think he has so profoundly shaped my vision and my sense of hope. Um, and one of the things I love about Thomas Berry is that he says the universe is so amazing, it must have been dreamt into being.
Yeah.
And then he goes on to say, and we are in such a mess, uh, politically, ecologically, culturally, religiously. We're in such a mess, he says, that we need to dream the way forward. We need to allow ourselves to imagine new ways of being, new ways of seeing, new ways of interrelating that we've never known before. And these words are so important for this moment in time, because there is a way forward if we faithfully access the imagination of the divine at the heart of our being.
Mm. So good. JP, we are out of time, my friend, but this has been great. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your work. I am a different person because of it, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Great to be with you.
Absolutely. And real quick, any place you want to direct people to go and interact more with you and your work, anything online you want to send us to?
Well, if people could be aware of our website, earthandsoul.org. Um, and one of the things that I've been meaning to say to you during our conversation, in that you're in North Carolina,
Hmm.
October, we're having the official celebration and sort of official launch of the new book at Montreat in October, and the date and details can be found on my website on the events page.
Great. Well, I'll put the links in the show notes and we'll do this again sometime.
Great. Many blessings to you and your family.
Thank you.